giving me a new.
No, the picture's different than it was. The one on the left is now showing me in reverse, sort of. I don't know what to do.
Push the button here and
Let's talk a little bit about inductive preaching, because that ties in with what we've just been talking about with pluralism and so on. As this mindset of people wanting more about emotions, being a little less logically turned, wanting something that's a little more involving of the audience, there's developed over the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years, what's called inductive preaching. It's not a real good name for it, in my opinion, but I don't know that I have a better one. The idea of inductive preaching is that the fundamental idea is that you engage the audience more in the process so that they are participants in the sermon more than just being listeners. You want to engage them in the process, that they feel like they're part of it. In this class, for example, I've tried to ask you questions, I'll let you answer, and try to make you feel like you're a participant in this class. Okay? Now, you can't quite do that in a sermon the same way, because you actually speak. So you got to do it in a way which people have the sense that they are participating, speaking, when they're not, which is a little more difficult. But you do it by asking questions and letting them think the answers. You do it by developing the sermon in a way in which you don't reveal everything at the first, and you sort of tease them a little bit and get them to thinking, and, well, what about this, and what about that, and what about this? Well, in view of that, what would we conclude? Well, here would be an answer we could give to all of that. And so you let them share and participate thoughtfully as they go along. So that's kind of the idea of inductive preaching. Sometimes it shows itself in the organizational structure, so that you, instead of announcing your conclusion to start with, you develop the evidence and develop the evidence, and then say, on the basis of this, what shall we conclude? Shall we conclude this? No. Shall we conclude that? No. Shall we conclude this? No. Shall we conclude this? Yes. You see how you kind of let them share in the process of it. Sometimes you can do inductive preaching in the sense that you just do it in little parts as you go along. When I preach on the book of Revelation, for example, I do a lot of inductive preaching. By that I mean, I say, okay, we have a character here who is the dragon. Who is the dragon? And I say, okay, turn to Revelation chapter 12, verse 9, and chapter 20, verse 2, and you tell me who is the dragon. And they read those verses, and they come back, and they say, well, sometimes they even ask them to say it out loud. So, okay, all together, who is the dragon? And they say, the devil. Okay. So you see, I'm engaging them in the audience. Or we come to the beast. And, okay, the Bible says the beast is this and this and this and this and this and this. Here are all the characteristics of the beast. I don't come out and say, now here's who the beast is and here's why. I say, let's examine the characteristics of the beast. He is a great world empire, rules over tribes and tongues and people and nations. He persecutes Christians. He's connected with the 7 hills. His 7 heads represent 7 hills. His 7 heads represent 7 kings, 5 of which are past and 1 is and 1's yet to come. You go through all these characteristics before I say who he is. See, that's inductive. You get the feel for that? You see what I mean? So it's not just a matter of how you organize the whole sermon. It's how you deal with different pieces of the sermon. But it is a way of letting the audience feel that they are more of a participant in the sermon than where you just announce conclusions and then tell how you reach them, and here's another conclusion, and here's how I reach them. Now, there's some preachers who say, I don't want to do anything but inductive preaching. And I feel like that, like I do about expository preaching. That's good. I do a lot of it. But I wouldn't limit myself to that, and I wouldn't limit myself to inductive sermons either, and say the only thing I'm ever going to preach is an inductive sermon. But I do think that finding ways to make the audience participate and think along with you as you go has a lot of benefits. Anybody have questions about what we mean here about inductive preaching and how it would feel, how you would do it?
What's your favorite? You already said that, I think, yesterday, the expository.
Yeah, I like expository preaching a lot. If I were preaching full time, I would probably do half my sermons expository. You know, let's talk about that a little. That's a good question. Now, some preachers like to preach through books of the Bible. We're going to preach through, after this week, those of you who've been taking Thessalonians ought to be able to preach through Thessalonians, okay? If you can't, Brother Edwards is a failure. Okay. Now, don't take part of that sentence and take it to him and say, I said he was a failure. That's not what I said. But anyway, that would be taking things out of context, which we don't do, right? But you, I like preaching through a book, preaching through Ephesians, preaching through Philippians, maybe preaching through Acts, preaching through Revelation. Now, you have to be careful with that in several ways. One is people can get a little tired of sermons out of Acts for a year and a half, you know. I've known of some people that preached through a book and they just went on and on and on and on, and people got pretty tired of that. When you do that, you need to focus on really key ideas and key events and key passages so that you don't get off of these significant things. Remember, significant is one of our words. So you want to preach on the significant things in that book. What that gives you a chance to do that is good is it gives you a chance to preach on some sensitive matters in a kind of non-threatening way. We talked about preaching on marriage and divorce, for example. You're going to do a series of sermons on Matthew. It's very reasonable that when you come to Matthew 19, you're going to preach on marriage and divorce. And nobody says, well, he just picked that out so he could talk about me. You know, I'm just preaching through the book, and there it is. And that's pretty good. So that gives you a way of dealing with some issues without appearing to some people to be threatening. You see what I mean here? So that can be pretty good. So you may have in the back of your mind some issues that need to be dealt with, and you pick a book that allows you to do that, and it comes naturally, and it doesn't come across as threatening, and that you pick this out because you know my circumstances. And so that's a good thing about preaching through a book. So expository sermons of that sort can be good. Preaching through a book on Sunday morning and preaching sermons that are subject-based on Sunday night would be a pretty good combination for a while. So there are a lot of preachers like to do short series, maybe 6 or 8 sermons on a particular theme in some way. That can be good. There are lots of ways of putting together sermons, but expository sermons have a lot to recommend them, I think. Inductive sermons, the idea of engaging the audience in the thought process as much as possible is a good thing to do. Yeah.
How do you make sure, I guess it's because maybe I didn't know it was happening, or I've never seen this actually preached this way. How do you make sure that they draw the conclusion, the correct one, when you give them 5 options? How do you make sure they pick the right one?
Well, you will eventually lead them to a conclusion. You won't just leave it up in the air.
Okay.
But you will try to make them think with you as you go through that process, so that by the time, hopefully by the time you have drawn the conclusion you believe is the right one, they've already gotten there. See, they've gotten there before you did, or at the time you did. That's kind of the goal that you're working toward. Okay, let's talk now for a while about supporting material. Chapter 7 in our book on preaching is about supporting material. And I want us to talk about that some and to see what we can learn about supporting material. Now, let me use the board just a minute to illustrate something here. We have in making an outline, we've talked about a subject sentence and main headings. So think of a table with legs, and you think of the tabletop as the subject sentence, and the legs are the main points. So that you have a statement, and these legs are the main points that support that statement. So in outline form, it looks like this: subject sentence, so you've got the subject sentence, which is the tabletop, and you've got the 4 main headings, which are the main points. And that would be the skeleton of the sermon. That's the skeleton. Now, it would not make a very effective sermon to get up and announce, here's my subject sentence, and here are the 4 main points. Thank you very much. I'll see you later. That wouldn't work too well. Why? Well, you have to hold these in people's minds. You have to give them some reason to believe that what you've said. You have to provoke their interest in some ways. You have to do some motivating. In fact, in the book, I give you 4 purposes for supporting material, 4 reasons to use it, 4 ways in which you use, which you try to do with supporting material. And supporting material is to clarify, to interest, to prove, and motivate. Well, let's talk about each of those a minute. You make point number 1, and you say, okay, I may need to clarify that a little bit. I need to help people understand what that means. And so you use supporting material to clarify that point. So point A, under number 1, may be something that will clarify some definitions, some other materials, some factual information, whatever, in order to clarify what that means. You may say about point 1, now that I've clarified it, now I need to prove it. How do people know that's true? So point B may be something that seeks to prove that point. You've got to prove it. On another point somewhere, maybe in the conclusion, you say, I need to motivate. So I want to use supporting material to motivate, to move, to interest, to inspire, to elevate people. And so you see a need for supporting material to motivate. And then you may say, I need supporting material to interest. I've got to hold their attention. I can't just go through this and let it be dry as a bone. I've got to have some interest, something to interest people, make it interesting. Remember we talked about biblical interesting, practical and significant.
Can you even say those words, like, let me prove this to you?
Well, sure. Here's why we've come to that conclusion. Here's why you ought to believe this. Here's the proof for this point, and so on, yeah. Now, so we're now going to talk about 6 different kinds of supporting material, which are for the purpose of doing these things. Now, what percentage of the material in a sermon is going to be supporting material, and what percentage is going to be the skeleton?
Say that again.
What percentage, if you've got a 30-minute sermon, how many minutes of the 30 minutes is going to be supporting material, and how many minutes of it is going to be announcing the skeleton?
20.
Yeah, well, 90% is going to be supporting material, or whatever, you pick the number. But so what I'm saying is, you, as careful as you need to be in developing the structure, remember, most of what you say is going to be supporting material. So you've got to do that part really well, or the sermon's not going to make it. So let's talk about these different types of supporting material. We're going to give you 6 different books. We'll give you a different list of these, but these are fairly common. The first one is quotations. Quotations.
Are these in any particular order, or just?
Not in any order of importance, no. They're just kind of random in their order, I guess. Quotations. Well, where would you turn for quotations for a sermon?
Bible.
I hope you turn to the Bible. That's where you need to get some of your quotations, of course. You may also want to quote commentaries. You may want to quote Bible dictionaries. You may want to quote Greek scholars. You may want to quote Shakespeare. You may want to have a poem. You may want to, there are all kinds of things you may want to do with quotations. Quotations is one of the kinds of supporting material. You can use supporting material to clarify. You may say, well, here's a word. Let's clarify what that word is, and here's the definition of that word out of the Greek lexicon or whatever. Okay. So you can use quotation to clarify. Use quotations to prove. Here's a prominent scholar who says this, and he believes that. Here's another one says that, and he believes this. Here's another one says that, and he believes it. So these 3 quotations would prove. You may say that these quotations from the Bible prove this. So you've got quotation from the Bible to prove.
Like a commentary of someone so said?
Commentary could be to prove, yes. Sometimes you will use quotations to interest. There will be people who are respected, and you say, they respect this person. He says this, so that quotation could be helpful. Sometimes quotations are interesting because they are in poetic form, or they're from literature that people are familiar with or something, and so it becomes interesting that you've quoted from that source. So that helps to interest. You can use quotations to motivate, as you perhaps Well, let's use a Bible quotation for motivation. You're talking about the subject of repentance from sin. And you say, remember what David said when Nathan came to him. I have sinned. Maybe you can quote from David, fifth per psalm, about how he felt about his sin. That would be moving to people to hear David say those things about his own sin. So, you can quote, I mentioned earlier today, this man governor of South Carolina, who admitted he'd had an affair. Well, right now, a quotation from him about what this has cost him would be pretty motivating, wouldn't it? Quotations to motivate. Okay. So, quotations. Now, as you are developing the sermon, you're asking yourself this question. What do I need to do right here? I've got this point. What do I want to do? Do I need to clarify it? Do I need to interest about it? Do I need to prove it? Do I need to motivate with it? And so you're developing your strategy as you develop the outline, and you say, right now I need something that's going to clarify, because I know this point is not going to be clear to people. We talked earlier about vocabulary. Maybe you've used a word that needs to be clarified, and so you have to clarify. And then you ask yourself, well, is quotation the way I want to clarify, or do I need to do it with some other form of support? One of the possibilities would be I can clarify by using the quotation. So quotations are one of the types of supporting material. Now let's come to another kind of supporting material. Factual information. Factual information. Okay, let's suppose that we are preaching on about, and for some reason in our sermon we want to speak about the death of Herod Antipas, who killed James, the apostle. The Bible talks about that. And so we want to tell about his death. And so we look up his death in the Bible. We look up his death in Josephus, who gives a very vivid description of his death. Maybe we find some other sources that talk about him. And so from that, we're able to pull together factual information about the death of Herod Antipas. And so we tell about that event using this factual information. Let me illustrate. Herod Antipas held a public occasion in the amphitheater that his grandfather, Herod the Great, had built in Caesarea, right along the Mediterranean Sea. You could sit in the amphitheater and look right out on the Mediterranean Sea. Beautiful view. And he decided to hold a public hearing that day. The amphitheater was arranged so that the people sat with their backs to the east and they faced the west. And they sat there on these stone steps in this well-designed amphitheater. And Herod came onto the stage of that amphitheater wearing a silver garment, a garment that was made of silver, not entirely, but silver in color, I should say, silver color. And as he was addressing the crowd, the sun rose over the back of that amphitheater and shone on this silvery garment, and made him look radiant and full of splendor. And people in the audience said, he's a god. He's a god. They were wanting to flatter him and make him feel good, you know. And he accepted their flattery and didn't rebuke them for saying that I'm a god, that he was a god. But it wasn't long until he was stricken with a stomach disorder, which the Bible calls worms. and he was carried away from the amphitheater to his palace just a short distance away, and shortly thereafter he died, after having said, I should have told him I wasn't a god. Now, where's the factual information? Did you see it? Amphitheater, facing the west, sun rising over. All this is right out of the history books and the Bible. Okay.
How do you know what history books to believe and which ones not?
Well, that's a very interesting question.
I mean,
Josephus.
I've got all the Josephus ones, and then I've got like the history of the Christian church. And
Sure.
But you don't know which ones are.
You have to use some judgment, of course, just like you do. Which commentaries do you believe?
Yeah.
I mean, you got to exercise some judgment.
Yours.
Joseph, yeah, there you go. Joseph, of course, boy, yay for you. Josephus is being shown to be more and more reliable, actually. It's very interesting. People, not everything he says is entirely accurate, probably, but more and more things are being discovered that show his accuracy, as a matter of fact. But on this, where his statement of it and the Bible statement of it are in very careful correspondence. They don't offer all the same details, but they're in careful correspondence. But you see, from the Bible, we get that Herod called himself a god. He was stricken by worms. I mean, he accepted their flattery that he was a god and stricken by worms, and that he was in Caesarea and all this stuff. Okay. And then Herod comes, and then Josephus comes along, gives us more details. Well, you see how much more interesting it is when you throw in the factual information. See, that really perks up people's interest in it. And you were talking the other day about how do you make it fresh. See, they may have heard that story before, but now it's fresher because there's more, there's something they hadn't heard before about this that you pulled in from history. So factual information can do a lot. Sometimes factual information is in the nature of statistics. Earlier today, we were talking about Tom Rayner and his statistical information about how unchurched people become churched. Okay? That's factual information. So factual information may be statistics of various kinds. It may be just isolated facts. It may be some kind of compilation of data. But you can use factual information to clarify. You can use it to prove. You can use it to interest, like we just did with Herod Antipas. You can use it to motivate. So, as you're preparing your sermon, you ought to ask, is this something about which I need some facts, some factual information? And then I need to know how to research and go and find the facts. Where do you go? What are reliable sources? Bible dictionaries are good sources for facts. Encyclopedias. Sometimes some commentaries are good at expanding on factual information and gathering it together. Obviously, various history books of the time and so on. You can get a lot of information on the internet.
But do you believe it?
Is it
Do you believe it?
factual?
I was waiting for somebody to say that. Well, I would certainly consider that a possible source of information. Now, you need to use more care on the internet because there has been for the most part, there's been no system of checking. See, if I write a book to be published, the publisher is going to make some effort to see if what I've said has some validity to it. I can't just write a book and get it published and say anything I want to because he bears some responsibility for its accuracy. Articles in refereed journals, that are journals of some note, the articles have been through some process of being checked before they're printed. On the internet, anybody can put anything they want to out there. So you obviously have to be careful, but I certainly would not ignore that as a possible source. I mean, man, I find lots of stuff on the internet. a quick way to find it, and if I know something about it and feel like that it is in correspondence with what I know and that the source is not just some nut, then, you know, I use that. I get lots of, we're going to talk tomorrow about visual aids. I get a lot of pictures and stuff off the internet. I did a 12-week series on Bible history and archaeology on Wednesday nights at our congregation. Used lots of pictures in every one of the 12 weeks and got every one of them off the internet. Every picture I got off the internet. It was easier to get them there than, I mean, I've got trays of slides I've taken to Holy Land. The time you scan it and get it in and all that stuff, you know, you've spent a lot more time than it'll take you to get it off the internet. So, yeah, it's useful for lots of stuff. But anyway, you do have to be careful. But factual information is an important source and is a respected source. And people respond well to factual information. They want to know what are the facts. And so by giving some good data, good facts, good information, you will be able to motivate, improve, and clarify an interest with factual information. The Bible has lots of factual information, doesn't it? Don't forget the Bible as a source of factual information. It's got lots of it. So if you're telling a story or doing something, you know, that's from the Bible, why, be sure that you utilize fully the factual information that's available from the Scriptures. Okay, that's, yeah.
When you're utilizing the Bible's facts and trying to put them in modern day terms, could you recommend a book or something? Because just something as simple as Goliath's height, I can look at 5 different books that all say 12'5" or 12'4", you know.
Yeah.
How do you
Well, that's where I would think a reliable Bible encyclopedia would be helpful. Something that is, you know, of good repute. International Standard Bible Encyclopedia or some others that are good standard sources. The reason that's the case, of course, is that sometimes the measurements that measuring systems we use, the measuring systems they use were not quite the same, and sometimes the converting it. How long is a cubit? Well, it's the length from end of your finger to the tip of your elbow, but we're not all the same height, you know, and so sometimes there are variations that come and things like that. So, yeah, so when the Bible facts are in some type of measures we're not familiar with, you got to be sure you convert them right, yeah. So factual information from Scripture, that's a good source, and other sources too. So we've got factual information is one of the good sources.
Explanation.
Explanation is the next one, okay? I want to caution you about explanation. Explanation is a way of restating, saying something in a little different words, of elaborating on it. And most preachers rely too much on explanation. Too much of their sermon is explanation. It's just saying the same thing in different words and kind of elaborating, and they're talking about it, but they're not adding more facts, they're not adding more quotations, they're not adding more other things that we're going to come to in a minute, illustrations. They're just kind of defining and talking and restating. And most preachers utilize explanation more than they should. So I would caution you about the use of explanation. Of course, it's necessary, and at times is the best thing you want to use, but be careful about overuse of explanation. It is You can't prove anything by explanation, can you? Explanation is not very good for motivation. Explanation is not very good to interest. Its only value is to clarify. So be careful about overuse of explanation. Explanation would mean that you have taken a term like repentance, and you've talked about it a little bit, and you have maybe you defined the word, and you have given some alternate phrases or alternate expressions for what it means to repent. But as soon as you can, you need to get into illustrations of it and examples of it and quotations about it and things like that. Don't spend too long in explanation. Don't spend too long in explanation.
But explanation can also be used to prove. And invoke interest as well, isn't it?
I really don't think, as I'm defining explanation, I don't think you can be used to proof, because it doesn't add any basis for proof.
Because I'm explaining it, not.
That's right. And I'm not giving, I might explain it in the sense that I can give you some reasons, but I've got to have something to back up those reasons. Just because I've said the reason and explained the reason doesn't mean it's true. I've got to have something that substantiates the reason, and that comes from some other source that comes from factual information or a quotation or some other source. So I would rely as little on explanation as you can. Okay, let's go to the next one. The next one is comparison. People find comparisons to be interesting. They like comparisons. That's kind of intriguing, kind of catches their interest. That's why Paul uses comparisons like Christian life is like a soldier. Christian life is like raising crops. Christian life is like an athlete. Those are all comparisons. The parables are comparisons. So comparisons can be quite interesting and quite helpful. Comparisons can be used to clarify, to interest. They can even be used to prove, in the sense that there is such a thing as proof by analogy, proving by analogy. That means that if two things are alike in all the known respects, they will likely be alike in an unknown respect. So you say, there's another congregation not far from where we are. There's a congregation, let me start over. The congregations in Lawton, Oklahoma got together and had a campaign. There were 5 congregations that worked together. Those congregations are all between 100 and 300 in size, or whatever numbers. They made very good preparation. They had materials to hand out. They got the people ready. They knocked on every door in town. They had outstanding results with X number of baptisms and all this. Okay. Here we are in a town that's about the same size as Lawton. There are 5 congregations here. We could all work together. We could do it. If it was successful there, it ought to be successful here. See, that's reasoning by analogy. That's reasoning by comparison. Now, there are 2 kinds of comparisons. There are literal comparisons and figurative comparisons. A figurative comparison is a Christian life is like running a race. That's a figurative comparison. It's not really running a race, but it has certain similarities. But that's a figurative comparison. You can't prove anything with a figurative comparison. You can only illustrate an interest and motivate, but you can't prove with a figurative comparison. If I'm talking about congregations in Lawton and congregations in Abilene, Texas, then I'm doing a literal comparison, you see. So here's a literal comparison. So you can prove by analogy with a literal comparison, but you can't prove by figurative comparison. But comparisons are very interesting. You can even compare things like saying that in terms of measurements, I may be off on my numbers here a little bit, I've forgotten, but the temple grounds that Herod built on which to place the temple was 6 football fields wide and 10 football fields long. That's a comparison, you see. It's factual information, but it's also a comparison with a football field. Well, we understand that gives us a picture of how big it was. So we can we can use comparison for interest, use comparison for clarification, we can use comparison for proof, we can use comparison to motivate. So comparisons can be very useful in the arsenal of digging out supporting material. Okay, let's look now at the next one. That is example. Now, as I tried to minimize to you the use of explanation, I want to maximize to you the use of example. This, I believe, is, in most cases, the most powerful type of supporting material. It's good to clarify, to interest, to prove, and to motivate. Now, let's think of using examples in 4 different ways. 4 different ways. First, there are comparative examples. Comparative examples. The comparative example is one in which you say that a certain Olympian trained for 10 years, spending 6 hours a day, went through all kind of rigors in life, denied herself lots of social contact, lots of other things, because she had this great goal to go to the Olympics and win a gold medal. Should we be any less willing to do things to prepare ourselves for our role in serving Christ? See, there is a comparative example, because comparative in the sense that what I want people to do is not be Olympians. I'm not wanting to go to the gym. I'm not wanting to win a gold medal. This is a comparative example. Preachers do this from history. You know, here is a person who shows great valor on the battlefield, and lots of these stories from World War II, Medal of Honor winners and things like that, and how this guy, the German machine gun was mowing down the Americans, and this guy and his 2 buddies exposed themselves in order to throw a hand grenade in there and got shot in order to save their buddies. Okay, we ought to be willing to make a similar sacrifice for the cause of Christ. This is a comparative example. We're not really asking people to throw hand grenades, you know. But those are stories that call on us for bravery, they call on us for sacrifice, they call on us for effort. And so these are comparative examples and are useful. They're fine. They're not as good, in my opinion, as some other kinds of examples, but they are useful and they're good, and I would don't discourage their use. But that's a comparative example. The next kind of example is a negative example. A negative example. And in the negative example, it is to tell what bad stuff happens when you don't do what I want you to do. Let me give you a negative example. Young people, you must stay away from drugs. Drugs are a terrible scourge on our society. You need to stay away from drugs. Let me tell you about a person that I know. There was a young woman who came to Oklahoma Christian, stayed for one term and then left, and soon fell into bad company. She got in with some people who did drugs. Before long, she was doing drugs, and she had to have some way to support her habit. And so she began to do shoplifting in order to support her habit. She got caught, tried, sent to jail for about 3 years for shoplifting. During that time, my wife was teaching a class for women in prison. She came to the class. She was thrilled to see somebody from the church. She was thrilled to see somebody connect with Oklahoma Christian. And it reminded her of the good time she had had there, and so she wanted to recommit her life to Christ, and so she came to the Bible class, was very faithful. When she got out, she came to our house and lived with us for a while. She re-enrolled in Oklahoma Christian. They let her back in. She started going to class and doing well in class, and everything was going fine. And in about a month, she decided to go see some of the friends she had that were in the drug world. And within 2 or 3 weeks, she was back in drugs, out of school, no longer staying in our house. We didn't hear from her for quite a while. One day, my wife got a phone call from her, and she said, I'm in drug rehab. I'm doing better. I'm getting my life straightened out. I want to come back to school. I want to start over and do it right this time. Will you help me? Okay. Came back to our house for a while. Got a room eventually over in the dormitory. In about a month and a half, she decided she'd see how some people that she had known before were doing. And you know the story. Back into the drug world again. Gone. Next time we hear from her, it's a frantic phone call that says, please come down and get me. I'm down here at the certain corner in Oklahoma City, down in the bad part of town. I've got to get out of here. My life is in danger. I'll come down and park at this corner, and I'll bring what I've got, and I'll come and meet you at that car. Get me out of here. Okay, we go down and park on this dark corner.
You did all this?
Yeah. See if she's gonna show up. In a few minutes, here comes this young woman walking down the street, carrying a basket. All she's got's in this basket. She gets in the car, and we get her out of there. We find a woman at the church who will keep her for a while, and got her a job at a grocery store not far from the house, so she could have a job and a place to stay. Pretty good. Well, in about a month, she decided she wanted to find out how some of her friends were doing. Right back into the drug world. I could go on and on and on with this story. What I'm telling you is, don't get involved with drugs. Now, that's a negative case, isn't it? It's a story of somebody who did it wrong. Somebody who did it wrong. Now, that has value. That can be told in a way that has some power to motivate and to interest. Negative stories are okay. Now we come to type number 3. What's that going to be?
Positive.
The positive case. In the positive case, you tell us about people doing it like you want us to do it. You want us to be honest, tell us about people who are honest. You want us to be evangelistic, you tell us about people who are evangelistic. You want us to be patient, tell us about people who are patient. You want us to be a good father, tell us about people who are a good father. You want us to be a good mother, tell us about people who are good mothers. You want us to be obedient children, tell us about obedient children. You want us to study well our Bibles, tell us about people who memorize Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in Greek. So you tell us about people who are doing what you want us to do. But these are the most powerful. This is the most powerful kind of example and the most powerful kind of supporting material. And it plays right into what we studied about the postmodern mind. They're attuned to stories. They're tuned to experiences. They're tuned to relationships. And you tell these stories in ways that they connect with that, and it's got powerful. It's got the power to move.
Quite a bit more powerful than the last one.
Yeah. So you tell about people who did it right. Now let me give some examples here. Okay, let's suppose I want you to be evangelistic. I want you to go out and talk to your neighbors. And I say to you, the people in this church are not going out and seeing their neighbors. They're sitting at home watching their television every night. They're not talking to their neighbors. They're not talking to their friends at work. What am I doing? Am I really motivating you with this? Because that's what a lot of preachers do. See, they tell about how we're not doing what we ought to be doing. Well, that's not going to turn me on. I don't think it's going to turn you on. There are preachers, unfortunately, who want to say, tell us how bad the brotherhood is. You know, we don't love anybody. We don't do this, and we don't. Well, that's not going to get us to do any better. I don't think it's true in the first place, but even if it were, that's not going to get the job done. Tell me about people who are doing exactly what you want me to do. Okay. You want me to tell the truth. You want me to be honest. You want me to stand for what is right. Here's a story. There's a young woman who's in nursing school. And she is about to finish her work to prepare to be a surgical nurse. She's been in this program for 3 years now. Finally about to finish it. But her finishing it well hangs on her doing well in the last operation in which she's going to help a doctor. This doctor is known to be somebody who is pretty hard on the nurses. He is known to be one who has watched some people out of the program because they didn't do like he thought they ought to do. So she goes into this operation to be his assistant, his helper, his nurse in this surgery with a little apprehension. Okay, so he does the surgery. He opens up the person, he does the surgery. They have used some sponges to absorb the blood. They do this, sponges to absorb the blood to keep it out of the way. And so her job partly is to provide the sponges and to count them to be sure that they've taken all the sponges out so that there won't be any sponges left inside. And so he gets ready to suture the incision, and she says, sir, there's one, I've counted the sponges, there's one missing, we need to find the other sponge before you do the closure. Then he looks at her and he says, hey, wait a minute, I'm the doctor, you're just the nurse. You're not supposed to tell me what to do. He says, sir, I know it's your job to do the surgery, but it's my job to count the sponges, and one's missing. And he says to her, don't you know I can wash you out of this program? You can't talk to me that way. You can't tell me what to do. You can't tell me how to do this surgery. And so he starts to make the motions to close. She says, sir, I must insist. There's a sponge unaccounted for, and we cannot make the closure until that sponge is accounted for. And he moved his foot. That was the sponge. Just testing. Did she have the courage to do what was right? Now, my point to you is that's going to move people to be honest a lot more than telling us how dishonest we are. You with me on this?
Yeah.
See,
Your pausing too helps.
I can't tell it. I bet I've told that story 50 times. I can't do it without crying. You know. That's gonna. See, that's the positive case. That's the power of the positive case. And let me give you some other illustrations. You want your congregation to be evangelistic. You want them to go out and talk to their neighbors. Let me share with you the case of Leon Luger. Leon Luger was an official with Phillips Petroleum Company in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. One day, he was also an elder in the church. One day, Brother Luger had a stroke that left him partially paralyzed. He couldn't walk normally. He didn't have the full use of his hands and arms. He spoke with a little bit of a slur. He didn't speak as clearly as he once had, and so the company gave him a medical retirement because he couldn't carry out his duties as he would have been able to do otherwise. So here he is. He's got time on his hands. He can use some time to do what he wants to. What's he going to do? Sit and watch TV all day, every day? No. Leon Luger says, I'm going to use this time the Lord has provided to talk to my neighbors. And so he sets aside a certain amount of time every day. And he goes walking down the street with his little limp, and he knocks on the door. He says, can I talk to you? Yes. Let me tell you about the church where I go. Would you be interested in a Bible study? And of course, not everybody says yes. But there were people who said yes, and he was able to have some Bible studies with people. And he was studying the Bible with them, and before long, they've made a decision to come to Christ. Here's a man using his time to do what Jesus says, to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Now that's a positive case, you see. Now that's going to get more of us to doing that than if I say to you, this whole church just sits around and watches TV all the time. See, that is not going to move anybody. That is not going to get them away from the television. So
why is it our desire though sometimes to do that?
I know. But we we've got to be smarter than that. Now, I'm not saying you never use a negative case, but I'm saying that accusing people of not doing right in a blanket way. See, that's the part I hate. See, nobody in this church ever talks to anybody about the Lord. Well, that's not true, you know. And overstatement is not going to get it done. But the positive example has got power.
Have you seen it? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Have you seen it where you actually can affect more lost people through positive examples?
Of course.
Or you see more people coming down because of.
Of course, you're gonna tell the story of somebody who has given their life to Christ. Tell the story of it.
It reminds me of the show I was watching this morning. I was sitting here throwing this gunk at the front of her computer screen.
Yes.
And she was letting a little girl do it. And she said, I would have never thought of this till I got that note from the officials telling us not to throw this on our computer screen.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
So if we're giving them bad examples,
bad
they might
examples.
just follow it.
That's right. Well, there are, you know, let me tell you a story about somebody who came to Christ. All right? I've told you already, my wife is very involved in prison work. She goes down to the county jail about twice a week and teaches women in the county jail. They've already finished a correspondence course. We circulate these correspondence courses in the county jail, and when they send them in, one lesson at a time until they've done 6 or 7 lessons, then it says, do you want to talk to somebody about spiritual things? Do you want to be baptized or whatever? And so they say yes, and then somebody from our congregation goes down to talk to them. And so she one day taught a young woman who had taken correspondence courses, and she decided that she would be baptized. And so she was baptized in the county jail. She then was sentenced to about 5 years in jail for the drug stuff she had been involved with. And she went to Mabel Bassett Correctional Institution, the maximum security place for women in Oklahoma. My wife was teaching a Bible class there for women. She came to the Bible class. So she worked with us more. She got out of prison, came and lived with us for 3 months. We got her a job, we got her a driver's license, all the things she needed to get started again. She eventually had a house to live in. She is now a faithful Christian, comes to church every service, has told her story to lots of young ladies to help them stay out of drugs and do what's right. Her sister was also in jail. Her sister has also been converted. They live together in a house. And as a kind of interesting side note, her mother taught my children in elementary school. Well, what do you get from this? Well, you see what she did, you see what my wife did, you see what others have done. This is a story of somebody making a decision to do what's right. So, stories like this have the power to move, power to motivate.
What are the differences in the preaching from the 50s and 60s, which some still do?
Don't call any names.
No, I won't. But you know what I'm talking about. But have we just learned through the year? I mean, why didn't they do that then? They knew what was effective and what was not, but
their method worked though.
Their direct method, it worked, but like he's saying now though, it's changing. But I just, a lot of them don't understand that we might, like you're saying, we might need to mold it a little bit.
That's right. Well, the good preaching has always used illustrations. Even in the 40s and 50s, there were preachers who used illustrations.
But it's like there was more passion about the gospel than there was about the people.
Well, in those days, people were conditioned differently.
Yeah.
They were conditioned to sermons that mostly were a compilation of Scripture.
Yeah.
And you could make a point. We're back to quotations. See, you give several quotations of Scripture that prove the point. Then you go to the next thing, and you give several quotations of Scripture to prove the point. Go to the next point, prove it with a quotation of Scripture, and that's a good sermon.
Yeah.
Now, this does not say that illustrations didn't work then. They did. They were not probably as necessary as they are now. Today, people are geared differently. We've watched television for years. We're clued into stories and the story format and all of that kind of stuff. Our attention spans are shorter. I mean, you know, when I was growing up, there were preachers who preached for an hour and a half, and people didn't throw a shoe, you know.
Like you said, they didn't have anything else to do.
That's right. And, you know, back when I was growing up in the days of Noah, we had that.
The lengthest one I preached is an hour and a half in
Yeah.
India.
Yeah, sure,
Wow.
yeah.
Nobody moved.
Yeah, different
Just
climate.
sat there staring at me.
Was anybody asleep?
Nope.
Wow.
Well,
No.
we usually preach like 45 minutes to 1 hour in
Yeah.
India. That's just regular.
Wow.
Sure. Well, now, as we've read in this book, most people have a different mindset, and illustrations are a lot more, they're a lot more necessary, number one, and they do the job in a more powerful way. And so the illustration is very important. And the positive case is the best of all. Let me give you another positive story, okay? Maybe you've heard on radio Dr. James Dobson. Have you heard of Dr. James Dobson? He speaks on the radio and other things. He has
Focus on the family,
written books about the strong-willed child and everything. I don't agree with all of his theology necessarily, but he does have a lot of good things to say about family life, and morals, and whatever. It's good. Well, when he was headquartered in California in 1988, he invited to be on his program a man named Pete Maravich. Does that name ring a bell with anybody?
Basketball.
Great basketball player.
Pistol Pete.
Pistol Pete, one of the great basketball players of his time, still holds, this is amazing, still holds the collegiate record for the most points scored in a game, in a season, in a career, in a career. And that was before the three-point shot. A lot of his points, he was famous for his long shots. Well, he had just completed his pro career, 40 years old, and recently had become a believer in Jesus, and it really changed his life. I mean, he had been profligate in his life, and he had made a real change in his life. And Dr. Dobson wanted to have him on his radio program. He invited him out to California, came out there, and so while he was there, they decided one morning they'd go out and play basketball. Wouldn't that be fun to go play basketball with Pete Maravich? So they all go out to the gym, and they're playing basketball, and they've taken a little rest from their basketball, and they're standing around just kind of taking shots, and Dr. Dobson's back here, three-point line, taking shots, and Maravich is kind of standing beside him, and all of a sudden Maravich just keels over backwards. Dr. Dobson rushes to help him, and they call for the paramedics, and he dies in Dr. Dobson's arms.
Is this a true story?
Yeah. 40 years old, one of America's great athletes, died at age 40 of a heart attack. Well, you can imagine how Dr. Dobson felt about that. I mean, how he was moved by that event. And he and his family talked about this a lot as to, what really matters in life. It's not really how long you live is not the issue. Where you're going to go when you die, that's the real issue. And so, as a family, they talked about that, and they decided that they would develop a family motto that expressed that idea. And what they said to each other was, be there. That meant, I want to be in heaven with you. And they expressed it by holding their hands out like this to each other and said, be there. Be there. Well, it wasn't long until Dr. Dobson had a heart attack. He's in the hospital. He's hooked up to machines and tube down his throat. He's conscious, but he can't speak. His son, about 20 years old, comes in to see him. How do you suppose they communicated? What they want to say to each other.
Yeah.
So the son gives this to the father, and the father gives this to the son. hope I get well if I don't. You know, Dad, I hope you get well if you don't. You know, we'll see you in heaven. Well, Dr. Dobson has told that on his broadcast several times, and I've heard it. And so I've told that to my family. That's our family motto in my family. And I've told that story to all my kids and all my grandkids. And we've made that a big thing in our family. My wife, when my children got married and my grandchildren married, she makes a little cross-stitch thing that says "Be there," and they put it in their home. They display it in their home. They gave me a keychain. A license tag. The license tag on my car says "Be there." Given to me by my children. My favorite picture is my 10 grandchildren giving me "Be there." When we had our 50th wedding anniversary, they gave us a golden "Be there." It's up by my door. Now, that's the most important thing in life to me, is to be there. And that ought to be the most important thing to all of you. See, I want to be in heaven with all of you. I want you to be in heaven with me. I'm going to say "Be there" to you, and I want you to say it back to me, okay? Be there. Be there. Say it to each other. Be there.
Be there.
Be there.
Be there.
See, that's what preaching is all about, isn't it? Is be there. Now, that's a true story. Every word of that's true. Has I got the power to move?
Yeah.
I've told that story all over the world. In Poland, "Be there" is "Vostjetan." In Kenya, it's "Kuakuli." In Brazil, it's "Esteja lá." I've told that story all over the world. Because I believe it is a story that motivates. It is a positive example. It's a positive case. Now, where do you find these? I took the words right out of your mouth, and that's very unsanitary.
Life experience is probably the best.
Life experiences. You have to be aware. You have to be aware of them. You have to be alert to them. You can find them in the newspaper. You can find them in. Just be alert and be aware and be sensitive to what's going on. You have to be careful. You don't want to tell something in the congregation you're going to embarrass somebody. You know, you've got to be careful.
Or tell something like it happened to you and it really did.
Yeah, that's right. Don't do that.
You gotta be careful.
You can ask people. You were talking about visiting with other preachers. You know, you can visit with preachers and get stories. There are some sources on the internet where you can go and get illustrations. I'd be a little careful about using those. Sometimes they're okay, but you know, it's kind of any other internet stuff. You want to be a little careful about that. There are books of sermon illustrations that can be of some value. But mostly you just have to be alert and aware and watch people. And, you know, some of these can come from the Bible. I mean, they're good, positive stories of people doing it right in the Bible. Apostle Paul, Timothy, Barnabas is a great story, you know. So you want to look for positive cases, the positive case.
The last 4 years in my preaching, there's only been one sermon that really everybody just really enjoyed, you know, because I don't get to preach that much.
Yeah.
And I just killed myself trying to figure out what was it about that one that everybody liked.
Yes.
But now that I think back, I started off with 2 real positive stories, and the first one was about Bill Smith.
There it is.
He loved the church. It was about loving the church, and he loved the church so much. When his wife was pregnant with her first child, and she was going to go to the hospital, and he said, on a Sunday morning, he said, "No, I've got to go preach." So, you know, and I think I really engaged the thought process of it.
That's right.
So I really believe that's
Now, take this last story about being there. Tell me what you think made the telling of that effective? What techniques of storytelling? See, I didn't want you to be aware of my techniques, but now that
Yeah.
you stop and look back at it, what do you see?
You didn't read it.
I didn't read it. I told it directly.
You paused
From the
it.
heart.
From the heart, you could tell it meant something to me. In other words, it did something to me coming out,
You were emotional.
emotional.
You paused
And I told it with some pausing,
Gestures.
some patience, some gestures. I told it in a way that was engaging. I told it like a good story. I filled it with details. Don't forget the details. I told you what year it was. I could even have told you it was January the 5th, 1988, when Pete Maravich went out there. Details like that.
I've never thought about
make
that.
Make it real, make it come alive. They help people to paint the picture in their minds. They're standing out on the basketball court. They've just played for a while. Now they're standing there shooting 3-point shots. You got the picture in your mind? See? That's all important as you tell the story. Tell it so they paint the visual picture. They paint the picture in their minds. And you do that by using lots of detail.
How do you determine when, using an example like this, if the reward is worth the risk? For example, yours, what if somebody hated the man that was on Focus on the Family?
Yeah,
Or
okay.
his, what if
Yeah,
somebody's like,
that's what I was curious about.
what if
too.
somebody was like, oh man, wasn't with his wife and that's all they thought about during the sermon? How do you
He just used James Dobson for.
Yeah.
But did you notice that I said I don't agree with him theologically?
Yeah, that was
Okay.
the entrance.
That's what gets it.
And then
That's
somebody can say, well, you know what, I don't either, but I'll listen to it.
That's right.
Yeah.
So in our fellowship, you probably need to say something like that.
Okay.
Well, yeah, there's some risk to it. You have to be, you want to be sure there's nothing offensive in it to people. You want to be sure that it's not going to, that people are not going to think you're betraying their confidence. You never want to betray a confidence, if you tell about something that happened that somebody came to you confidentially and told you you were involved in this situation. You must be very careful not to betray confidence.
I'll give you an example.
Okay?
This wasn't an example. I know we're talking about we're talking about examples right now. This is a different type of illustration.
Right.
But a couple of Sundays back, I preached on getting rid of not returning back to the old man. And it talks about how we put back on the armor of darkness. So to illustrate it, I put in the pulpit a hanger and no one knew it. I took out the hanger and hung up my jacket and I talked about I was getting ready to re-wear it. And that's what we've done with the armor of darkness sometimes. So then I put it down on the ground and I said, now I'm not getting ready to re-wear it. It's getting wrinkled and stuff. A bunch of people said, oh, that was a great sermon. I had like 2 women that came up to me and they said, I just was so worried about your suit coat being on the ground. I just couldn't stand to see it getting wrinkled.
Yeah. Okay.
So how do you determine when the risk is worth the reward?
Especially with object lessons.
That's right.
That's right.
Well, that's a really interesting story. I don't know. You just have to you just have to try to think through, put yourself in the mind of people in the audience, and ask yourself, how's this going to play with people? And if next time you'll do that, but you'll find something to instead of throwing it on the floor, you'll lay
Put it
across
over the
pulpit
pew or something?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I don't know. I don't have any magic.
Do you use object lessons very much? Or?
Not very much, but some people use them pretty well.
I'm not a real fan of them.
I'll tell you something that's when I was probably 12 years old, I remember a man speaking on the need to evangelize the world. And he had 10 pennies. and he laid them out on the pulpit, and he said, if you want to know how many Christians there are in the world, people who have really committed themselves to Christ in the scriptural way, there are none in this tenth of the world's population. And he threw away the penny on the floor. There are none in this population. There's none in this 10% of the world's population. There's none in this. And he got down to the final penny and said it is only a small part of this last penny of people who are true Christians. And that has stuck in my mind for 65 years.
True. I've seen it done wrongly, I think, every time.
Of course.
And I think they've abused it. One guy had a casket where everybody got after the worship service, or during the sermon, walk up and see the mirror, inside the casket.
Yeah, you got to be careful.
And I was,
You got to be real careful. Objects can be helpful.
Wow.
Objects can be useful. You have to be real careful that it fits and that it's not. There's an old saying. Let me say this, and then we'll take a break in a minute. Let me set this up a little bit. Preaching is an art. Preaching is not a science. Preaching is an art. What I mean by that is there's no absolute rules. There's no putting this in a test tube, you see, or weighing it on the scale to see if this is going to work. The question you just asked me, it's intuitive. There's a lot of intuitive to it. There's a lot of trying to be artistic about developing the sermon and developing the supporting material. I mean, that's something that you develop the skill at like an artist. A sermon is like a piece of music. It has a certain way to begin, the introduction. It has a certain way to bring it to a conclusion down here at the end. One of my objections to modern music, to rock music, is it violates the conventions of good music. It doesn't. It starts out here and stays here and quits there. There's no rising action and falling action. It's just, all of a sudden everybody quits. They don't come to some concluding chord or anything else. They just all finally they all okay, let's quit. They quit. There's a lot of similarity between preaching and good art. Now, good art conceals its artistry. If you look at a painting and the main thing you see is the technique of the artist, then that's not good, see. You don't want your technique to be obvious. Your technique needs to be, it needs to be there, but it needs to be there in a way that people are not aware of it. Not aware of it. If, even taking sports, when a baseball, pitcher, when he's pitching, you're aware of how great the pitch was, but you're not aware of every kind of technique he uses, to hide the ball and all this stuff. You're watching the motion and the flow. So good artistry conceals its technique. Now back to your point, see, is that if you use an object and that is so stands out so much, people say, oh, he's using an object lesson. There's something kind of jolting about that if you're not careful. And so they say, oh, that kind of hurts because I see what he's doing. I see his technique. So good art conceals its artistry. And so I'm not saying don't ever use them. I'm just saying that they have to be used in a way that doesn't kind of jolt people and make them feel, you really got people, if you're doing a good job with preaching, you kind of got them, they're kind of caught up in the web. I mean, I don't mean the World Wide Web. I mean, they're kind of caught up in the moment, you see, of the preaching. And they're kind of, it's like listening to a beautiful piece of music. It's like seeing a beautiful painting. They're kind of caught up, a play. They're caught up in it. If you do something that kind of jolts them back to reality, that's a little, it kind of destroys what you're doing. So somehow if you're not, the casket thing, see, is just gonna, it's just, yeah, it's just not gonna work, people are gonna say, that's terrible. So,
He was trying real
I know,
hard.
I know. But anyway, that's why some of those things don't work, is because they kind of jolt you out of your sense of.
They reveal too much.
Of the artistic that's going on here. Well, let's take a break. Let's take about 10 minutes, and then we'll go for another hour or so and finish up to give you time to get to church.
Are you ready for our papers now that we've?
Yeah, you can turn your paper there.